A minority report from Illinois, housing priorities costing taxpayers, the center square at the White House, and America's talking. This is the Center Square Daily for Thursday, June 4th, 2026. I'm your host, Greg Bishop. As state houses across the country continue their work, some have adjourned for the summer. The Illinois General Assembly wrapped things up Monday at 5 in the morning after being there the day before at 10 in the morning. Our team was there for the long haul. Illinois legislators passed nearly 400 bills this session. That includes Illinois' largest state budget in history, featuring another round of tax and fee increases and also legislator pay increases. They also advanced bills dealing with rideshare worker unionization, regulations on e-bikes, measures loosening who's eligible for in-state tuition, and an extension of the swipe fee prohibition, and that's tied up in the courts. Joining us to react to the end of session and what Illinois taxpayers may expect for the months ahead is Illinois House Minority Leader Tony McCombie. Leader, thanks for taking time with us here for the Center Square Daily. I want to start with House Speaker Chris Welch and something he had to say about the majority party's priorities standing alongside Governor J.B. Pritzker Monday morning.
We're in the midst of an affordability crisis created by, I believe, the worst president in American history. The things that people are focused on are the things they're talking about at their kitchen table. How do they pay their electric bill? How do they pay their grocery bill? Those are the things that are top of mind to people.
Leader, does this budget make running state government more affordable for taxpayers?
No, absolutely not. And it's interesting that he talks about affordability while standing there in front of the press room and forgetting to mention that he paid himself, not only with a pay raise, but a reappropriation for $40 million for Proviso High School.
Leader, obviously a lot of issues were discussed during the budget process, but not really until the last 48 hours. Talk about the transparency for taxpayers, and are they getting a fair shake when it comes to these final days and hours of legislative session when you guys go into session starting way back in January?
Yeah, and the week before, we were in for only 64 minutes during general session. And, when you're talking about transparency, we have none. And unfortunately, those of us that have been in a few years are starting to get used to, and you as well, this isn't your first session, having this be after midnight. But the other thing is that there was no real hearings. They were only subject matter. We've had advocates and taxpayers down to Springfield for 6 months now, and they don't know where their line items are going to be or if their priorities are going to be met. And here you have the budget in the House passed at 4:13 in the morning, but you had the budget implementation bill passed before that, the revenue, the tax increases before that, the capital before that, completely out of order, and certainly a lack of transparency. And that's why people don't trust government. And it doesn't have to be this way. It doesn't have to be. They keep talking about, well, there should be no concerns or questions because the final budget was 99% the same as the governor's proposal from February. Well, it certainly wasn't 99%. And when you're in a committee room hearing after midnight and saying, well, another amendment's going to drop and we're just going to take that right to the floor, that's not transparency at all.
Leader, obviously Republicans are in the super minority at the Illinois State House. Did any Republican priorities advance in this budget?
Oh, sure. There always is. Education funding, bringing back the $50 million through the EBF for schools for property tax relief if they so choose to apply. The payment for pensions is certainly a priority. And you heard President Harmon say, if we stay on this path, no more pension holidays or sweeteners, we could be at a 90% funding by 2045. That might sound like far away, but we're in such a hole right now, at least we can see an end there. So those are a couple things, certainly that are a priority for us. Before we even were willing to even have conversations about negotiating or collaborating on a budget, one of the priorities that has to be removed from the budget is the funding for HBIS. That's the healthcare for illegals and non-citizens, as well as welcome centers. I mean, there's close to $200 million of funding for folks that are not residents of Illinois, paid for by residents of Illinois. So before we even get that far, we have to make sure some of those things are removed, and they weren't.
Now, obviously, this is the largest state budget in state history, $55.9 billion, includes a series of new tax increases. One of them sticks out that impacts consumers is the tire tax that goes up to $2.50 for a tire. When does this stop? I guess is one thing I think taxpayers may be asking. Is it seems year after year after year, it's hundreds of millions of dollars of different kind of taxes here and there, and things that are going to impact corporations, but also are going to impact small businesses, and tax increases on gasoline, even though there's a penny and a half that's going to be saved per gallon for 6 months of this budget, that's still set to go up in this budget year that's upcoming. How do we get to a point where enough's enough?
That's a great question, Greg, and one that we often ask. Every year I say this is the biggest budget in history. Every year I say we're going to continue to nickel dime, including this year. So the last 2 years, we're now at $2.8 billion of tax increases under this governor. In the last, excluding this budget, there's 57 new tax and fee increases, and it really is nickel diming. And I find it interesting, and I never usually hit President Harmon. It's not my house, but he made a comment about how humans people are not going to be taxed in this. And he's talking about the social media platform, the crypto, the fantasy sports, the digital, the prediction markets. Well, humans use all of these, and humans will pay the price that's passed on to them from the companies. So to say that taxpayers aren't on the hook is completely false. And there has to be, at some point, they realize there's no additional dollars for tax increases, fee increases, diversions of dollars, especially with the road funds, which I don't know how deep you want to get into that or not, but I think that's, especially with gas prices so high, is certainly at top of mind for everybody. But at some point, it's got to stop.
Well, and I think, that's a good kind of segue, because obviously gas prices are high. And for months, it seems that the governor's been asking about suspending the gas tax to provide some kind of relief, or addressing the sales tax that's on top of the gas tax. But all we got was that 6-month suspension of the adjustment that happens every July 1st, tied to inflation to the gas tax. What else should have been done with that?
Yeah, well, we were calling for a pause on the sales tax. And as you are aware, there is a sales tax on top of our gas tax, so a double tax. And those funds were originally supposed to, be going to our road fund. Well, this year they decided to divert $150 million from the road fund because of this surplus, because the high amount, rather than give it back to the consumer or even pause the sales tax. They're like, well, let's just go ahead and put that into the general revenue fund, and they can spend how they want. And some of your viewers might be saying, well, wait a minute, the road funds, I voted for a constitutional amendment putting gas tax into a lockbox. Well, the loophole is this is a sales tax on the gas tax. So they feel they can, again, slight the folks that voted for that, saying, hey, we want roads and bridges, and then spend it the way they want. They could have been like Indiana. Here you got a guy who's possibly running for president. Why not be like Indiana politically and say every month, I'm pausing the gas tax, I'm pausing the sales tax, and run that for the next 6 months. But instead he says, no, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and pause the 1.3 cent that's going to save you and your family $5. Thank you for the cup of coffee. But we're not going to pause the sales tax portion of it, where that is real money that could be a savings, especially when the Democrats have been running all year on affordability, and when they have no idea what that means.
We're talking with Illinois House Minority Leader Tony McCombie here with the Center Square Daily, getting reaction to the end of legislative session. Almost 400 bills passed. One big question that was not advanced, at least in the House, was the Senate's version of the Bears deal, which the House had passed, a mega projects deal. Here's what Speaker Welch had to say on Monday.
We need to continue our work on AI regulation. We need to continue our work on affordability. We need to continue our conversations on the Bear Stadium question. I know in the House, we need time to review the bill that came over early this morning. We need to know, where do the Bears stand? We need to take the time to get it right.
Leader, do you anticipate there may be a special session called this summer?
No, and you're hearing that from the governor as well as the Dem leaders as well. And I think they lose the Bears. I don't want to be negative, but they had real opportunity. They hold the majority in the House and the Senate and hold the constitutional offices, and they couldn't sit down at a table together with the Bears and work this out. A mega projects bill is so much bigger than the Bears that we passed over, and it wasn't perfect, but we were under the understanding that it would come back. There would be the property tax protections in there, which is what we wanted, and would really help spur investment in Illinois and help the Bears at the same time. But that didn't go far enough, and the Senate couldn't get the votes they needed. So they come back with something different, kind of similar to what other states have done in these kind of situations. I'm assuming it would have given the Bears the property tax certainty that they were looking for, and then it would have given the locals the power to get this deal done. But here we are. Session's adjourned. I don't think we'll be going back until veto session, which is going to be the week after Veterans, so 2 weeks after the election. At that point, I think the Bears will already have made their decision. I hope I'm wrong.
Well, even the governor was asked about a possible special session, and while you may not anticipate the House or the Senate to call one, he does reiterate here that he's got the power to call a special session as well.
Well, I know that the House has said that they're going to continue to work on this over the summer. I think the question of a special session is a question really for the legislators and not for the governor here. They've got to come to an agreement about something or other, and then either one can call a special legislative session. I can as well.
Leader, what should have been the priorities at the State House? I know you've had members talking about public safety issues, and even the governor months ago seemed to be open to the idea of addressing questions about the no cash bail provisions in the Safety Act. How do you get those things across the finish line being in the minority party?
Well, we continue to advocate for them. The number one concern in Illinois, whether you're a Republican or a Democrat, is property tax. And when you're talking about affordable housing, which is a priority or stated to be a priority of the governor, reform our property taxes. I've been there. This is my 10th year. I think we've had 18 different task forces put together to study this, and no legislation has come out of it. The governor and the majority party want to continue to blame local officials for the high property taxes, but yet we're undercutting our locals, whether it's the cities, villages, or school boards or community colleges. All the things that you see on your tax bill. So we're given no choice locally but to raise taxes, and it shouldn't be that way. We should stick to our agreements and go forward so we can work together. And there's things that they could do, and we offer solutions, and we'll continue to offer solutions. We'll continue to expose and oppose bad policy. We'll continue to work with rank and file members to make a bad bill better, and we'll certainly continue to be their checks and balance when it comes to process.
House Minority Leader Tony McCombie from the state of Illinois, greatly appreciate you taking the time with us today for the Center Square Daily. Well, taxpayers across the country writing checks to address homelessness in a variety of different areas and capacities, but there could be a change in federal spending priorities. Just to get a sense of some of the conversations that are happening around the country, over in California, in LA, the county there is reimbursement of homelessness issues $53.7 million from the county. And that's for interim housing, with $52 million received this year alone. But residents in Los Angeles, they're raising concerns about how some of the homelessness hotspots are being handled by local officials.
Constituents in Skid Row face violent sweeps every single day, and unlike everywhere else in the district, do not get sufficient notice. The metal OHS signs in Skid Row serve the purpose of allowing city workers, along with LAPD, to come and destroy people's lives. We need an urgent change in Skid Row, and while we 100% know sweeps should end completely, constituents in Skid Row should get the same notice that others in the district do. Why can't sufficient notice be given to Skid Row ahead of these violent, traumatic sweeps?
Now, in Austin, Texas, officials there are discussing funding for homelessness programs through the Homeless Strategy Office, and it includes subsidies, with some attention on how the subsidies are affecting local and statewide taxpayers. In Fort Wayne, Indiana, a planned shelter and the estimated costs that continue to balloon, that was questioned by a resident at their city council meeting.
I am a member of St. Paul's Lutheran Church, and I'm here to speak against the proposed location of the low-barrier homeless shelter. One of our primary concerns is that this is going forward with inadequate planning. Funding relies entirely on donations and public dollars. What happens when pledges dry up? Fort Wayne will have spent $6 million renovating a building for a nonprofit it does not control that may not be able to sustain operations. In 2022, Indianapolis conducted a feasibility study for a slightly smaller, low-barrier shelter and projected $4 million per year in operating costs, more than 3 times Mayor Tucker's estimate. For a 2.5-year horizon, Indianapolis projected $10 million. Fort Wayne is projecting $3 million for the same period. That gap demands explanation.
Now, it's not just conversations happening at local city councils or county buildings. It's also being had in state houses across the country. At the Michigan State House, there are conversations about spending $3 million for transitional housing, including converting a area to make 10 apartments in northern Michigan. The plan uses fundings mixed from private investments, but also state taxpayer funding, signaling both local and statewide financial impact. Now in Louisiana, costs have been discussed and how to deal with homelessness, including a $30 per day jailing costs compared to shelter costs that can get up to $20 million a year. And again, that's highlighting some of those taxpayer expenditures. At the New York State House, officials are discussing subsidies for homelessness programs with the state budget, including $250 million for housing vouchers. Now, housing vouchers are said to keep people housed, but some criticize the affordability and the amount of money being spent. And in the halls of Congress, there are discussions about $3.5 billion to be budgeted to support at-risk or homeless veterans. Again, that includes that taxpayer allocation of hundreds of millions of dollars. But what else could the federal government do? And are there efforts to ensure the best use of those limited tax dollars? Well, let's bring in the Center Square reporter, Tim Clouser. Tim, how is the Trump administration's housing and urban development approaching the homelessness issues? And just how much is this going to cost taxpayers?
Yeah, so the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD, they released a new funding availability earlier this week, which was represents a drastic shift from the approach from the last 15 years to what they're moving forward to in the years ahead. And that's shifting from housing first to a recovery first format. So essentially in this $4 billion funding availability, they put new caps on how much funding will go towards renewing projects that have been around for years, mainly permanent housing projects, and in an effort to push a considerable amount of the funding towards new treatment-based case management type of services. The goal here is to stop spending more and more money on these taxpayer subsidized beds, where oftentimes you have people living for years while they continue to use drugs without any precondition for participating in treatment. The goal here in the federal government is to save taxpayers money. Now, service providers aren't entirely happy, considering that they've been funding these permanent housing projects for years, but other supporters of this change think that it could represent quite a big difference moving forward in terms of measurably reducing visible homelessness and getting people to the point where they're able to get a job, able to pay for their own home unit and groceries, and to get off the streets themselves. You know,
from what we saw of reviewing just some of the conversations that are happening at local city councils, at state houses across the country, it seems that there's been this kind of focus, this priority of housing, of using tax dollars to set up these types of permanent or semi-permanent housing conditions. Just how much of a drastic shift is it of the Trump administration looking to instead do those types of rehabilitation services rather than focusing primarily on, is there a roof over this person's head?
Yeah, the past few years, the way the government has handed out funding, it's usually around $4 billion. This is the highest it's been. The last few years, it was just under $4 billion. But essentially, 90% of that funding in the past would go towards renewing these permanent housing projects. And then the other 10% would go towards case management, treatment, and stuff like that. Now there's going to be a 60% cap on that renewal funding. So it pushes about 1.5 or so billion dollars towards these new projects. The federal government's issue with the permanent housing projects isn't that people are being housed. It's that there's no preconditions to hold them accountable for these tax dollars that are funding the beds that they're sleeping in. Essentially, you have like some of the clips that Rand mentioned, these low barrier shelters, which essentially means that to receive housing assistance, you don't have to be sober, you don't have to participate in treatment or anything. You just have to show up and you get the service. Now, that's not going to change entirely. There's not going to be requirements that you, in terms of receiving the federal funding, that you have to participate in treatment. But the federal government is saying to continuum of cares and these service providers that are applying for funding that if you do ask these homeless individuals to participate in treatment in order to participate in your service, then you might compete better for funding than if you don't. So it's going to be quite a big shift. We'll likely see a lot of major cities like LA, Seattle, and Spokane shift how they apply for these fundings to adhere more to the funding availability. But what I've heard, particularly in Spokane, is that they're worried about the shift, but are trying to preserve local funds so they can backfill any gaps.
Well, and the question I was going to have about is who's managing this? Is it going to be the local governments who are getting those grants from the federal government, or is the federal government going to give them straight to the service providers?
Yeah, so how it'll work is in the next few weeks and months, you'll have the service providers working with the continuum of cares, which is essentially in a lot of metro areas, you have these continuum of cares, which is this collection of service providers and local officials that figure out what projects they want to prioritize for their homelessness response, and then they apply for that federal funding. Now, it's up to the federal government to award that funding, and they've set out a list of criteria in terms of how they're going to grade those project applications. Now, if you're clearing public encampments, picking up trash and needles, not permitting public drug use, you don't have needle injection sites, stuff like that, you can earn extra points. You can also earn extra points if you try to incentivize people to participate in treatment. So it's going to be up to the federal government to hand out these awards, but ultimately, once those awards are handed out, it's up to the service providers and the continuum of care to operate these services under the guidelines of the federal funding availability. And then it's up to the federal government then to hold them accountable to that.
Have officials made clear how tax dollars are going to be held accountable in all of this? You know, we hear stories all the time, not just with the Medicaid fraud that there is, but even questions about how, for instance, California, anecdotally, has spent billions on addressing homelessness, but it just doesn't seem to be actually addressing homelessness. How have officials indicated they're going to show some level of accountability here?
Largely through changing the funding guidelines that I had just talked about. And then moving forward in years after this, the goal is to tie funding to performance metrics. So in the years past, like I said, they've put much of the funding towards these permanent housing units, which have housed people, but you're not getting people to a point of self-sufficiency, to a point where the spending is going down. In the last, since 2013 to 2020 to 2015, from 2013 to 2025, nationwide, we saw homelessness increase 27%, and then taxpayer-funded beds increased 151%. So the goal here is that by tying funding to metrics moving forward, that will fund more of these treatment-style facilities, these housing projects that do require participation in treatment in order to receive housing. That once you see the success from these, they'll be able to better fund these projects moving forward.
Greatly appreciate you delving deeper into this, and we'll be watching your work and work from the rest of the team at the Center Square. Be sure to get Tim's story and others by subscribing to the Center Square newsletter, free at thecentersquare.com. Well, now it's time for At the White House. With an election year upon us, one talking point politicians are out stumping on is affordability. And you've got a frequent critic of President Donald Trump heading into the midterms, being Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker. Earlier this week, he took an opportunity to blast the Trump administration with some pretty harsh words.
A president of the United States that is attacking the people of Illinois and the people of the United States, particularly working families. And literally billions of dollars have been taken away from people in our state. We've seen these massive tariffs that are affecting people at the grocery store, when they're going to buy a car, everything else in their lives. Costs are going up. And then we've got this war that's raised the cost of gasoline for everybody.
Now, the governor obviously addressing the conflict in the Middle East. Well, Center Square's Washington, D.C. Bureau Chief Sarah Roderick Fitch was with the president yesterday in the Oval Office, and she got an update from the president about where we're at in that conflict.
Are you concerned at all that the IRGC could sabotage any potential deal?
Anything can happen, you know, when you're dealing with Iran, but when you're dealing with other countries. But that's a very volatile part of the world, probably the most volatile part of the world. The people are volatile, the leadership, you see what's going on. By the way, just to finish off on that, we had the strongest stock market in history, and I said we have no choice, we have to do it. I knew it would affect it, but I was very happily surprised when I saw that today we hit another stock market high. I mean, we have the highest stock market in history with a military conflict going on, or a war. Some people call it war, some people call it a military. It's not a big thing for us. We have a great military, it's not a big thing for us. But if I didn't do that, I spoke to people like Peter, great financial people, Scott and Howard and lots of others. I said, you know, we just hit the greatest stock market in history. Everyone's 401ks are the highest they've ever been. Everybody's making a lot of money. Costs are coming down. You know, we took over the highest cost and the highest inflation in the history of our country. Costs are coming down. Everything's good. And I hate to tell you this, but we've got to take a little detour and go down to a place called the Islamic Republic of Iran. And we're going to have to stop them from having a nuclear weapon. That's what we've done. And they've agreed to that. By the way, if they signed the agreement, they will have agreed to, we will not have a nuclear weapon or bomb. We will not develop one. We will not buy one. You know, originally it was, we will not develop. I said, what about if they buy? That went into a 2-week negotiation. But in the end, we got that. Now, we got it if they signed the paper. In theory, they're pretty close to signing a paper. We've actually gotten along with them very well. And you know what you saw for the last few nights? It takes two to tango. You understand that.
Now, the president talking about how the economy is still resilient while the ongoing negotiations to end the conflict in Iran continue. Elevated gas prices still impacting taxpayers and those filling up at the pump day by day. But the president, he was also discussing a variety of other things in the White House yesterday, including public safety. The president went on to question those in particular, like Governor J.B. Pritzker and sanctuary state policies, plus a reluctance of local authorities to work with federal officials to focus on public safety. Here's the president.
If I didn't get elected, we wouldn't have a country. We really wouldn't have a country. This country would be finished. But I see what's happening in Los Angeles. I see what's happening in New York. Where I look at Chicago, you have a stupid governor, a dumb governor, a really dumb guy. I know him well. He's a failure in his family, Pritzker. I know the family. I was partners in a deal with them. I made a lot of money. They made money. We made a good partnership. But he was like an outcast in the family. He was a slob. And the mayor is a low IQ person. I mean, he's a stupid person. In Chicago has a case, real chance to become great again. There's a case, great again. Oh, by the way, in Louisiana, what I've done there is unbelievable. Because the governor, Jeff Landry, called. He said, "You got to help me with New Orleans. We have a tremendous crime problem." And I sent in our really talented people, including National Guardsmen, and they did an unbelievable. They had the safest. They said they had the safe. We just ended about 3 weeks ago. They had the safest Mardi Gras they've ever had. I could do that in Chicago, but you have to have the support of a governor. You can't have a slob that says, we don't want it. People get murdered, and he says it's fine. They lost 5 or 6 people last week, and they said, it's fine. They're not going to lose 5 or 6 people. And I would make Chicago so good and so safe. It's got potential. The longer it goes, the harder it is to fix.
Now, the ongoing spat between Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker and President Donald Trump expected to continue as we get closer to the midterm elections, where the governor is up for re-election, but a lot of anticipation as to whether he's going to decide to run for president in 2028. Yesterday, the governor's political team put out a speech he gave to the communications workers of America Legislative Political Conference. And he said, quote, "Trump and MAGA are failing our workers right now. The Trump and Vance administration have since costs skyrocketing and empowered wealthy corporations to treat them like garbage." And he says, if you ask me, it's time for Republicans in Washington to cut the BS. Stop lying down on the job and start standing up for workers. And if they want to prove that they stand with workers and not the corporate overlords, they can start by doing it like they did in Illinois, enshrine the right to unionization in the U.S. Constitution. So you can expect you'll hear a lot more from Governor J.B. Pritzker heading into that midterm election. All right, let's now look at some of America's talking with headlines from across the country that you can find in the description below or in your inbox with the Center Square newsletter. And we'll start with federal tax credits of up to $1,700 each can now begin in 2027 for North Carolina families whose children are participating in the Signature Education Initiative of President Donald Trump. The Educational Choice for Children Act, known as House Bill 87, late Wednesday afternoon, got a 30-19 votes override from the Senate. May 20th, the House of Representatives in North Carolina sent it to the upper chamber, with all 71 Republicans and former Democrats, now independent, signing on board for support. The Center Square managing editor Alan Wooten reports that North Carolina becomes the 31st state to formally opt in, the 5th of which has a divided government. This means 2 legislative chambers and the governor's office are not the same party. Now, 23 are Republican trifectas, and 3, Virginia, New York, and Colorado, are Democratic. In the wake of the nation's first ban on AI nudification apps passing the Minnesota legislature, the Center Square reporter Julia Kramer reports that Pennsylvania legislators working hard to keep up with their own bill that'll address the harmful and rapidly developing deepfake technologies. While the Commonwealth has already seen several bills introduced to protect individuals from the harmful use of artificial intelligence, including misleading AI chatbots, legislation concerning apps that can undress individuals from a single photo have yet to be made. Now, Republican State Senator Tracy Pennysuick is proposing a bill that would see the distribution of nudification apps completely banned. The Louisiana regular session for the legislature concluding with 2 major energy-related bills stranded in the chambers without even being called for votes. The Center Square energy industry reporter Alton Wallace from Louisiana reports that one of those bills, House Bill 509, sponsored by Representative Charles Owen, would have required a public hearing in any parish where a company planned a carbon injection well. After passing the House 94-0 in May, the bill was returned to the calendar, subject to the call, where it sat unvoted for 5 days until the session adjourned. Now, during the 2026 session, Louisiana officials and industry leaders, they opposed several bills that would add administrative hurdles to development of carbon capture projects. The House Committee on Natural Resources and Environment became a graveyard for a series of bills aimed at giving local parishes control over carbon capture projects within their jurisdictions. And we've also got more from different areas. Again, you can find these stories at thecentersquare.com, where you can get the newsletter in your inbox each and every morning. The U.S. Department of Transportation investigating security protocols for Metro Atlanta's transit system. Secretary Sean Duffy announcing that Thursday. The Center Square Associate Editor Kim Jarrett reports the probe comes after a 66-year-old woman was stabbed to death while riding the Metro Atlanta Transportation Authority train May 30th. 6 days before that fatal stabbing, another man was stabbed during an altercation at a train overseen by Transit Systems, commonly known as MARTA, according to the Transportation Department. Now, the investigation comes less than 2 weeks after thousands of visitors are expected in Atlanta for the World Cup games. MARTA spokesperson says that the safety and security of their customers and employees is their number one priority. And again, that's just some of what America is talking about. Get those headlines at thecentersquare.com. From my studios in Central Illinois, I'm Greg Bishop, and you can join us back here Friday for more stories impacting you, the taxpayer, from all around the country, only with the Center Square Daily.